He trusted her with everything, his heart, his secrets, his future. But what she did next shattered him in a way he never saw coming. Betrayal, heartbreak, and a twist that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about loyalty. Stick around to find out what happens when trust is broken, and how one man finds the strength to rebuild himself, piece by piece. You won't believe what happens next. He trusted her. For months, they were inseparable. Every morning, he kissed her goodbye before heading out to work. Her smile always lingered in his mind. It was a feeling he cherished, a feeling of security. But nothing could have prepared him for what happened that night. The room smelled of cheap whiskey and stale cigarettes. He had just returned from a long day. His best friend, Mark, was there, lounging on the couch, a beer in hand. "Come on, man, relax," Mark said, slurring his words. But something felt off. The air was thick with tension, though no one had spoken a word yet. He glanced at her. She was sitting on the armrest, her legs curled beneath her, eyes distant. There was an uncomfortable silence that lingered between them. She seemed distracted, her gaze drifting toward Mark. He thought nothing of it at first, but the longer he watched, the more uneasy he became. His thoughts raced. He wasn't sure why, but something wasn't right. It was the way her eyes lingered on Mark, how they shared a brief, almost unspoken moment. Suddenly, he felt nauseous. He stood up, pushing the thought aside. "Hey, I'll be back in a minute," he muttered, heading toward the kitchen. But as he passed through the hallway, he heard something. A soft laugh. His heart skipped a beat. He stopped in his tracks. His instincts kicked in, urging him to turn back. Slowly, he moved closer to the sound. And there it was. Through the crack in the door, he saw them. Mark. And her. Their bodies entwined. His best friend, and the woman he trusted with everything. It hit him like a punch to the gut. His body froze. He couldn't breathe. He wanted to scream, but no sound came out. All he could do was watch. Watch as she betrayed him. Watch as she did the most disgusting thing with the man he called his best friend. The weight of it pressed down on him. A feeling of disbelief, anger, shock. His chest tightened, and his eyes burned with a mixture of rage and hurt. He wanted to leave, but his legs wouldn't move. And then Mark saw him. For a brief moment, their eyes locked. Mark's face twisted in confusion, then guilt. But it was too late. The damage had been done. His heart shattered, piece by piece. He turned, walking out the door without a word. As he stepped into the night, the cold air hit his face. But it couldn't numb the pain inside. He walked aimlessly down the street, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the empty night. The cool air bit at his skin, but it didn't matter. Nothing mattered anymore. His mind raced, replaying the scene over and over again. How could they do that to him? How could she? His thoughts spiraled. The trust he had in her felt like a lie now. Something false, something he had imagined. He clenched his fists, fighting the urge to break something, to scream. But there was no one to hear him. Only the silent city and the weight of betrayal that pressed on his chest. How long had it been going on? Were there other moments? Was he a fool to believe she loved him? His phone buzzed in his pocket, dragging him from his thoughts. He pulled it out, expecting a message from Mark or from her. It was from her. The words burned through the screen, sharp and cold. "Where did you go?" He stared at the message, his hands shaking. Her words seemed so simple, so innocent, yet they felt like poison. Did she think he would come back to her after what she had done? He couldn't fathom the audacity. He typed a response, his fingers trembling. "I saw everything." He waited, staring at the screen, his breath shallow. The seconds stretched into minutes. Finally, her reply came through. "I didn't mean for you to find out like this." His heart sank. What did that even mean? He was supposed to be the one she trusted, the one she loved. And yet here he was, abandoned in the dark, with nothing but shattered trust. He didn't know what to do, where to go. All he wanted was for the world to stop spinning. He glanced around, taking in the dark, empty streets. The city felt so foreign now, like a place he no longer belonged. He dropped the phone, letting it fall to the ground with a soft thud. It seemed fitting. The world had crumbled, and so had he.
Mark.
Her. Everything. It was all gone. And he couldn't put it back together. He stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the phone on the ground. The buzzing in his ears had drowned out the rest of the world. The streets seemed to fade away. Everything was distant, like he was watching it from far away. He wanted to scream, but the only sound that came out was a choked sob. The pain was unbearable. But it was more than just pain. It was confusion, anger, a deep, gnawing emptiness. Why had she done this? Why had she destroyed everything? His mind kept returning to that image, the two of them intertwined. He couldn't escape it. He picked up his phone, his hands unsteady. The screen lit up, and another message from her flashed on the screen.
I'm so sorry. Please talk to me.
Please don't leave me. Her words felt like an insult. The guilt she tried to weave into her apology only deepened the wound. He gripped the phone tighter until it almost cracked in his hands. He couldn't trust her anymore. He couldn't even look at her the same way. He thought about Mark, his best friend. The betrayal stung even more now. Mark had been the one he confided in, the one he trusted to have his back. But now, Mark was just another part of the broken world she had helped create. He couldn't face him.
Couldn't look him in the eye.
Couldn't pretend that everything was okay. Every piece of his reality had shifted, and he didn't know who to trust anymore. How could he have been so blind? A strange sense of numbness washed over him. It was the only way he could deal with it. He needed to get away, to escape the suffocating silence. His feet moved on their own, carrying him through the dark streets. It was as if he were walking in a fog, disconnected from the world around him. The sounds of the city were muffled. The lights blurred. Nothing felt real. Everything felt fake. As he reached a park bench, he collapsed onto it, his hands trembling as they ran through his hair. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions.
He wanted to punch something. Scream.
Anything to release the pressure building inside. But all he could do was sit there, broken. Everything felt like a lie. The woman he loved. The best friend he trusted. He felt like he was suffocating. And no one could hear him. He pulled his knees to his chest, burying his face in his arms. The tears came slowly at first, then in heavy waves. The city, the people, the world, it all felt so far away. He couldn't reach it. Couldn't go back to the life he once knew. Not after what had happened. Not after everything he had seen. He was alone. He sat there for what seemed like an eternity, the cold air biting at his skin, his tears mingling with the rain that had begun to fall. Each drop felt like another weight on his soul. The city lights blurred into streaks of color, but nothing could clear the fog in his mind. He had never felt so disconnected, so utterly alone. The truth of what had happened was suffocating. The betrayal wasn't just about her. It was about Mark. It was about everything he thought he knew. It felt like his whole life had been a lie, wrapped in a false sense of security. The pain twisted inside him, unbearable, but it didn't stop. He couldn't even think straight anymore. His fingers gripped the bench, digging into the cold metal, but it offered no comfort. Nothing offered comfort. Not even the empty silence of the night. He pulled out his phone again. The screen flickered to life with another message from her. Please talk to me. I'm begging you. I never wanted to hurt you. The words blurred in front of his eyes. She sounded so desperate, so broken. But it wasn't enough. He couldn't find it in himself to care anymore. He typed back a short, cold response. It's over. And just like that, it felt final. He hit send, his thumb pressing down harder than necessary. But that wasn't enough either. The message was just words. The hurt was still there, gnawing at him. The betrayal still stung. deep inside his chest. He stood up abruptly, tossing the phone into the rain. It hit the ground with a soft thud, disappearing into the growing puddles. And then he walked away. No destination, just movement. The night swallowed him whole. Every step felt like a painful echo of what had just happened. But as he walked, the weight on his chest began to lighten, even if just slightly. Maybe the first step toward healing was leaving. Maybe the first step toward healing was walking away from everything he thought he knew. He kept moving, though the path ahead was unknown. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't care what was waiting at the end.
He had to keep going.
Because there was no going back. The further he walked, the more distant the noise of the city seemed. The harsh clamor of life, the chaos that once surrounded him, now felt like a faded memory. The world seemed quieter in the darkness, almost as if it were holding its breath. And in that silence, he could hear the echo of his own footsteps. Every step he took was a reminder of the painful reality he had just left behind. But as the night stretched on, something inside him began to shift. It wasn't peace, not yet. But it was the beginning of something different. Something less suffocating. He didn't know how long he had been walking, minutes, hours? Time had lost all meaning. His legs were tired, his body aching, but he couldn't stop. Not yet. There was a flicker of something stirring within him. A spark of defiance. He wasn't going to let this define him. He wasn't going to let this heartbreak shatter who he was. He couldn't. Not after everything. The betrayal had stolen so much from him already. It wasn't going to take his future too. But even with that thought, the pain was still there. Like an open wound, raw and relentless. The truth hung over him, like a dark cloud, suffocating. He kept walking. He didn't know where he was headed, but somewhere deep inside, he knew he couldn't stay in that place. The place where memories of her and Mark lingered in every corner, every streetlight, every shadow. He needed space. Time to breathe without their ghosts haunting him. He stopped at an intersection, his chest rising and falling with each ragged breath. A car drove by, headlights briefly illuminating his face. He squinted, the light too bright, like a jolt of reality. For a moment, he felt as if he were waking from a nightmare, but the nightmare wasn't over. Not yet. He couldn't make sense of it all, but he knew he had to keep moving. One step at a time, even if it was just to put more distance between himself and the people who had shattered his world. And yet, a nagging thought lingered in his mind. Would he ever be able to trust again? Or had this moment broken him forever? He didn't know, but he knew he couldn't go back to the life he once had. Not after tonight. Not after what he had seen. He wasn't sure what came next, but he would find out piece by piece. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. He was done with the lies. Done with the betrayal. He had to rebuild. From the ground up. And somehow he would. The city lights flickered in the distance as he walked further into the night, his feet carrying him without a clear destination. It was as if he had become part of the shadows, a figure lost in the void of uncertainty. Every corner he turned, every street he passed, seemed to reflect the brokenness inside him. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he couldn't stay in the place where everything had fallen apart. The cold air bit at his skin, but it was the numbness inside that truly stung. The ache in his chest refused to fade. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the loss of trust, the loss of something that he had believed in so deeply. He had thought he was different, thought his relationships were different. But this was a reminder that everything could change in an instant. As he passed another darkened alleyway, a soft voice echoed from behind him. "Hey, are you alright?" He stopped dead in his tracks, heart racing. He hadn't noticed anyone nearby. Turning slowly, he saw a figure standing in the shadows, vague and indistinct. For a moment, his mind raced with thoughts. Was it someone he knew? A stranger? But no, it wasn't. He took a cautious step forward, his gaze narrowing.
I,
I'm fine, he muttered, his voice hoarse from the weight of everything. But the stranger didn't move. The figure seemed to study him, a sense of curiosity and concern written across their face. You don't look fine, the voice said, a hint of warmth in the otherwise cold air. Something about the stranger's words struck a chord with him.
He didn't want to talk.
Didn't want to explain himself to anyone. But something in the stranger's eyes made him hesitate. Who are you? He asked, the question sounding foreign to his own ears. The stranger smiled faintly. I'm just someone who sees people when they're lost. The words felt almost too familiar, as if they had been said to him before. He opened his mouth to speak again, but the words caught in his throat. He couldn't explain it, but there was a quiet reassurance in the stranger's presence. He wanted to break down, wanted to scream about everything that had just happened. But instead, he found himself standing there, frozen. It was as if the stranger was waiting for him to make the next move. He looked at the figure in front of him, eyes filled with pain and confusion. And for the first time that night, he felt a flicker of something more than just anger and hurt. He felt understood. A strange comfort in a moment that should have been filled with nothing but sorrow. But that comfort was fleeting. He knew that healing didn't happen just because someone spoke kind words. No, it would take time. Time he wasn't sure he had. But for the briefest moment, standing in that dark alley, he felt the weight of his world lighten. Just a little. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first step. The first step toward something else. Something beyond the darkness. The stranger didn't speak again. They just stood there, watching him with a steady gaze, waiting patiently. The world felt suspended in that moment, like time had paused, allowing him a sliver of peace he hadn't known he needed. For a few breaths, the noise of the city seemed distant, like an echo from another world. He wanted to say something. He wanted to ask why this person had appeared when they did, why they seemed to understand his unspoken pain. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he simply nodded, a small gesture that somehow felt like more than he had offered all night. Without another word, the stranger turned and started walking down the alley. For a moment, he thought about following. Maybe this was the sign he needed. Maybe there was something he was supposed to find, something that would help him make sense of the chaos in his heart. But he stayed still, the weight of his own thoughts keeping him rooted to the spot. The stranger's figure slowly disappeared into the shadows, leaving him with nothing but the cool night air and the quiet hum of the city. He let out a shaky breath, his chest tight again. But something was different now. It wasn't the weight of betrayal. It wasn't the crushing sense of loss. It was something else. Maybe it was hope. It felt strange to even think it, but hope was the only thing left that hadn't been stolen from him. The darkness wasn't gone, but it felt less suffocating. He started walking again, more slowly this time, the rhythm of his steps steady but unsure. There was no grand revelation, no instant clarity. But maybe he didn't need it yet. Maybe, for now, he just needed to keep moving. To keep putting one foot in front of the other, even if the path ahead was still unclear. Because somewhere, deep inside, he knew that the road to healing didn't come in one moment. It came in thousands of tiny steps, each one a small victory over the pain that threatened to swallow him whole. And though the world still felt broken, there was a flicker inside him, a spark of light in the distance. He didn't know if it was a path toward forgiveness or just a way out of the dark. But for the first time that night, he allowed himself to hope that it was a way forward. One step at a time. The next few days blurred together, each one indistinguishable from the last. The silence in his apartment felt suffocating. He tried to keep busy, to drown out the thoughts that gnawed at him, but it didn't work. The images of her and Mark, of the betrayal, kept creeping back into his mind. It was like a loop, playing on repeat, taunting him with every painful detail. But he kept moving. He went through the motions, even though his mind was elsewhere. At work, he kept his head down, trying not to engage. His coworkers noticed the change in him, but no one asked. No one really knew what to say,
and he was grateful for that.
The days felt heavy, each one dragging on longer than the last. He avoided any contact with Mark. The thought of seeing him made his stomach turn. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the way Mark had looked at him that night. Guilt? Regret? It didn't matter. It wouldn't change what had happened. But as time passed, something began to shift inside him. He wasn't sure if it was the passage of time or something deeper, but the weight on his chest started to lift, just slightly. He didn't forgive them. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But he started to realize that forgiveness wasn't for them. It was for him. It wasn't about forgetting what had happened. It was about letting go of the pain, of releasing the grip the past had on him. One night, as he sat on his couch, staring out the window into the dim city lights, he thought about the stranger. The person who had appeared in the alley, the one who had silently offered him a moment of peace. He didn't know who they were or why they had come into his life at that exact moment, but somehow their quiet presence had reminded him that he wasn't truly alone. There were still people in the world who cared, even in the darkest times. And maybe that was enough. He stood up, walking to the window, the cold glass cool against his palm. The city outside was still the same. It hadn't changed, but he had. It was subtle, but he could feel it. Something inside him was healing. The anger was still there, just beneath the surface. The hurt lingered, deep in his chest. But he wasn't consumed by it anymore. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to breathe without the crushing weight of betrayal suffocating him. He didn't know what came next. But for now, he had taken the first step. And that was enough. The days grew shorter as winter edged in, but inside, something was starting to thaw. He was no longer running from the pain. He was facing it one small moment at a time. There were still times when it hit him, unexpectedly, like a wave crashing over him, knocking him off balance. But he was learning to swim through it. It wasn't perfect. Some days felt like an uphill battle, others like a walk through quicksand. But there was a small, growing sense of resolve inside him, something he hadn't felt in weeks. He wasn't sure when it happened, but somewhere along the way, he had stopped waiting for the world to fix him. He was fixing himself. It wasn't about forgetting. It was about moving forward. And the more he focused on that, the more the past seemed to lose its grip on him. One evening, as he sat in a small cafe with a book he hadn't touched in months, he heard a familiar voice.
Mark.
He stood frozen for a moment, his heart leaping into his throat. Mark was standing at the counter, looking over his shoulder, searching the cafe with hesitant eyes. Everything in him told him to turn and leave, to escape the encounter he hadn't planned on. But then, Mark's eyes locked onto his, and for the first time since the night everything shattered, Mark didn't look away. He didn't offer an apology. There were no words at first, just the weight of what had happened between them, heavy in the air. Mark took a cautious step forward, then another, until he stood by the table. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Finally, Mark cleared his throat. I know I don't deserve it, but I wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything.
For what I did to you.
And to her. He stopped, his words faltering. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. For a moment, the old anger flared up in him, a sharp, hot feeling, but he fought it back. He was different now. He had changed. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to demand explanations or punish anyone for their actions. Instead, he looked at Mark, his face cold, but his voice steady. I don't know if I can forgive you, he said, the words coming out slower than he expected. But I'm trying to move on. And I can't keep holding on to this hate. Mark nodded, his face crumpling with regret. I understand. I don't expect anything from you. I just wanted to tell you I'm sorry. I've lost more than you'll ever know. You were my best friend, and I messed that up. I'll live with it. The weight between them seemed to ease, though it didn't go away. And then, to his surprise, The anger in him began to dissolve, replaced by a strange kind of acceptance. Not forgiveness, no. That would take time, maybe more than he had. But acceptance of the reality that this was who they both were now. Two people, once close, now changed by the choices they made. Maybe the road ahead wasn't about rebuilding what was broken, but finding new ways to live, to grow from the wreckage. Mark gave him a long look, and without another word, he turned and walked away. For a moment, he sat there, staring at the empty space where Mark had stood. He didn't feel relief. He didn't feel closure. But he felt something else. Something softer. A weight had lifted off his shoulders, not because of anything Mark had said or done, but because he had finally made peace with himself. And for the first time in a long time, he realized that the future was still wide open. Not perfect, not fixed, but open. And that was enough. The days that followed were quieter, less heavy. The tension that had once consumed him was no longer a constant presence. It wasn't that everything was perfect. It wasn't that the past had been erased. But there was room now, room to breathe, to think, to move forward. Each day felt like a small victory. He spent more time with the things he had neglected, books he'd left unread, hobbies he had put aside in the chaos of the last few months. It wasn't about distraction. It was about rediscovery. He hadn't realized how much of himself he had lost, how much he had given away in the hopes of holding on to something that was never truly his to keep. But now, slowly, he was learning to reclaim the parts of himself he had forgotten. One evening, as he walked through the city streets, the cold air biting at his skin, he realized how much had changed. The world still felt fractured in some ways, but there was a sense of quiet strength inside him. He had stopped searching for answers that would never come. He had stopped asking why. The past would never make sense, and he knew that. But he also knew that he didn't need it to. The night was peaceful, the city lights reflecting off puddles from the earlier rain. For the first time in months, he didn't feel the weight of betrayal pressing down on him. He didn't feel like the broken version of himself he had been for so long. He was okay. It was a simple realization, but one that felt like a breakthrough. And in that moment, he understood something he hadn't before. Healing wasn't about forgetting what happened or pretending it didn't hurt. It was about learning to live with the scars, accepting them as part of the story. He reached a park bench, the familiar one he had sat on during the darkest nights of his pain. Tonight, though, it felt different. Tonight, it felt like a place to rest, not a place to escape. He sat down, closing his eyes for a moment, letting the stillness settle around him. A soft breeze brushed against his face, and for the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. He had let go of so much: anger, regret, fear. And in return, the world had opened up, offering him the chance to move forward. Not with all the answers, not without scars, but with the knowledge that he was strong enough to face whatever came next. And that, perhaps, was the greatest gift he could give himself. As the days passed, the city continued to pulse with life around him, but he no longer felt like an outsider looking in. The world had moved on, and so had he, in his own quiet way. He had learned to navigate the echoes of his past without letting them define his present. There were still moments of doubt, still whispers of the betrayal that had once haunted him. But they were fading, like old scars that no longer hurt as much when touched. The more he allowed himself to heal, the more he realized that life wasn't about avoiding pain. It was about how you chose to carry it. He found himself talking to people again, friends, co-workers. Not with the same guardedness he once had, but with an openness he hadn't felt in a long time. One afternoon, he ran into Sarah at the local cafe. She had been a distant acquaintance before all of this, someone he hadn't really connected with. But she had seen him struggling and had offered kind words when no one else did. They sat together at a table by the window, sipping coffee as they talked about everything and nothing. He didn't realize how much he had missed conversations like these, simple, unburdened exchanges that didn't require explaining or justifying. For the first time in a while, he laughed. It felt strange at first, like a muscle he hadn't used in years, but it felt good. Real. He wasn't sure if he was ready to open up completely, to dive into relationships the way he had before, but the idea didn't terrify him anymore. It felt natural. Possible. Later that evening, after parting ways with Sarah, he took the long way home. The familiar streets, the quiet hum of the city, no longer felt like reminders of his past. They felt like the backdrop to his future. He stopped by the park again, the bench still there, waiting for him. This time when he sat down, he didn't feel lost. He didn't feel broken. He felt whole, or at least on his way to being whole. He had come so far, but he knew the road ahead would still be filled with challenges. There would be setbacks, moments where the old pain tried to creep back in. But he was no longer afraid of it. For the first time in a long time, he could see the future with a sense of clarity. It was his to shape. And for once, he was ready to embrace it, scars, struggles, and all. Because he had learned, finally, that there was strength in the pieces that remained. And in time, those pieces would come together to form something new. Something better. Weeks turned into months, and though the pain never fully disappeared, it became something he could live with. It no longer controlled him, didn't dictate his every thought. He had learned to let it exist, alongside the other parts of his life, without letting it define him. One evening, as he sat in his apartment, he realized just how far he had come. His apartment, once a prison of memories and silent reminders, now felt like a home again. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever was. But it was his, and it felt like it was finally becoming a place where he could breathe. There were still moments when his thoughts wandered back to Mark, to the betrayal that had once shattered his world. But it no longer consumed him. He had learned to keep moving, to carve out a life beyond the heartbreak. And maybe, just maybe, that was the most powerful lesson he had learned. He was stronger now, not because of what had happened, but because of how he had handled it. He didn't need to seek revenge. He didn't need to chase closure. He had found it within himself. One evening, he found himself walking through the park again, the same park where he had sat months ago. This time, however, it felt different. He wasn't hiding from the past. He wasn't running from the memories that haunted him. He was simply existing, walking forward, a sense of peace settling over him. As he reached the bench, the same one that had once held so much weight, he paused for a moment.
He didn't sit this time.
He just stood, staring out at the calm evening sky. For the first time, he felt the fullness of the moment. Not the ache of betrayal, not the weight of anger, but a quiet acceptance. The future stretched out in front of him, uncertain but full of possibility. He didn't know exactly where he was headed, but he knew one thing for sure. He was no longer defined by the past. He was free to write his own story. And for the first time in a long time, that thought felt like a gift.